piping is a really wonderful finishing technique which gives a professional edge to things, and I'm going to show you how to do it really easily. So this is the piece for the bias piping. As you can see, there's a grain line arrow, so it's got double arrowheads either end, and this line has to be perfectly parallel with the selvage of the fabric, which is the bound edge. To make sure it's perfectly parallel, I'm going to measure from this end of the line to the edge of the fabric, so here it's 13 centimetres. The other end is also 13 centimetres, so that it's nicely parallel with the selvage edge, and once that's parallel you can pin around the outside edges. So cut out around the solid line, and you can see I'd left the pattern quite roughly cut originally, and now as I cut around the solid line I'm cutting that excess tissue off at the same time. And when I get to the notches, I cut out around the notches. You can see there's a solid line and there's a dotted line. The dotted line is the stitching line, and indeed if I cut the notches inwards as they're shown, I will be cutting far too close to the stitching line and would end up having a hole. So always cut outwards around notches. So I've used a chalk and a ruler to mark the cutting line from end to end, and I'm going to use those to cut along later, but the first step is to sew the two ends together. And this is when people get confused, because you sew together with the notches matching so that the lines will flow from one to another, and you actually have a bit hanging over either end. So I'm going to sew that together, and actually what you'll end up with is a seam sort of on the bias, which means it's more stretchy. So that seam is now stitched and ready. And then using my scissors, I can cut along my previously marked chalk line. And as I cut all the way round, just through the one layer, to make sure the underside isn't caught up in the cutting, I follow my chalk line, and it keeps going round and it spirals. So you get one long continuous strip. And that is now ready to fold in half, wrong sides together. So to make sure you find a bit that has the seam, and fold it in half and press it folded in half. So that needs to be pressed on the ironing board. I'm just going to put a pin in that bit. Make sure I do it the right side all the way. Opening up that seam allowance, it's only a tiny seam allowance. And of course the seam allowance is now on the bias too. And this means that when I attach it to my cushion, it will go round the corners nicely without puckering, because there's bias in it, there's some stretch in it. So the strip has been pressed wrong sides together. I've tucked the raw end of the short end under, so that's to the wrong side, and then I've sandwiched a piping cord between the layers, pushing it towards the fold all the way down the length. I'm now going to stitch down the centre just to hold that cord in place, and to remind myself to not start at the very beginning, but to start a little way on. I've double pinned. So I'm going to stitch from there all the way to the end to hold that cord in place. So for this row of stitching, I can use the regular foot, and when I add the piping to the cushion front, then I'll use the zipper foot. Go forward and backwards. And again, I stopped before the very end. So I take that out, and this is now ready to pin to the front of my cushion front. So I've stopped short at that end, and I started a little way in at that end. We now need to attach the piping to the front of the cushion. So with the cushion right side uppermost, I'm going to pin the piping to the edge. I'm going to overlap it very slightly. And as you can see, I've still got that end open with the short end tucked in. So I'm going to start stitching, as I did before, a little way from the start, so about there, and stitch down to the corner. And this time, I want to stitch closer to the actual piping cord than before. So in order to do that, I'm going to put on the zip foot so that I can get closer to that bulky piping. The zip foot is the one with a single toe and grooves either side. So when I attach that foot, I want to make sure that the actual foot is as far away from the chunky piping as possible. So I shall attach it to the bar on this side. And to do so, I line the bar on the foot with the groove on the foot holder. Make sure the thread isn't caught in that. And lower the foot onto the bar. Because the foot is different to the one I was using just now, I want to make sure that the needle is going to go down through the little groove by the side of the foot and not hit the foot at all. I'm also going to move it over. So I'm going to move over the needle as far as I can, which that little beep told me it's as far as it can go. So I've now got the stitching quite close to that piping cord, and you can see it sort of bulk up, and as I'm stitching I can feel along. It's not as close as I want to get, because when I do the next row of stitching, adding the front to the back, I'm going to get even closer to that piping cord. But for this one, closer, so you're to the left of the previous row of stitching. So again, forward and back to anchor the stitching, and then off we go down to the corner. Now you'll notice I haven't tried to pin the piping all the way round, because you'll find when you get to the corner you're going to snip into the piping tape or the piping fabric, and then you're going to push it round the corner. And if you try and pin it and snip that all the way around before stitching, it'll suddenly get out of line and it won't work. So it's better to do it in sections. So as I get close here to the pin, which is at the corner, I'm going to stop with the needle down and then raise the presser foot so that I can snip into the fabric of the piping on that angle, so that I can now pivot it round and have it going along the next row. Push it down, lower the presser foot, and off we go again. So I'm just going to put in a couple of pins just to hold it in place. Again, I'm going to pin at the other corner so that I'm ready to stop with the needle down. And the beauty with sewing piping, when you turn this through, if it's not as nice and snug a fit as you want it to be, just do it again. You haven't got to take the stitching out, you just have to stitch closer to the actual piping cord, and each row that gets closer to the cord hides the other row, hence you don't need to actually unpick anything. So I'm now going to get back to the beginning, so I'll just do a little bit further. And when I'm about 2 inches or 5 centimetres away, stop with the needle down. I'm going to trim off the excess, and I want to trim it so that there's an overlap, probably about 1 inch or 2.5 centimetres. Just trim it off. And this is why you left that bit open, so I can now open that up and put that inside. But what I want to do, I don't want 2 lots of cord, So I'm going to trim back the undercord so that the cord ends meet. Push that in. Make sure it's a nice snug fit. Pin the layers together. And then I can continue sewing. So I'm going all the way across all of those layers now till I reach the beginning where I started to stitch. Back stitch there. So that's now attached nice and neatly all the way around with the ends neatly overlapped, and that is ready for me to put the back on. So I sandwich the piping and the bow between the back and the front, so right sides together. I've pinned all the way round and I've turned it over so I can see the previous row of stitching. I've also double pinned because I need to leave a turning gap. So I've double pinned to remind me to stop stitching when I get to there, and double pinned where I'm going to start stitching. So pop it under the foot, and I'm going to just move it over just one tweak so that this row of stitching is to the left of the previous row, which is why I've turned it over so I can see that previous row of stitching. Take out my pins. And this is when it's a really good idea to feel either side of the piping cord as you stitch, so that you're sort of giving it definition and you're stitching as close to the cord as you can. As you get to the corner, again, stop with the needle down, pivot it. You can take 1 or 2 stitches on the actual corner. So I'm going to pull that pin out just to be sure. Pivot it round a bit more, and again I'm feeling for the cord either side so I can make sure I stitch to the left of the previous row of stitching. So here I am now back at the double pin mark, so that reminds me I'm going to stop here so that I'm leaving my turning gap. Just lock the stitches by back stitching. And now I'm going to trim off the edges and cut the corners at an angle and trim off about half of the seam allowance. And then the next thing to do is to make sure that the fabric doesn't fray. I'm going to go around with a zigzag stitch, so half the stitch, the zag, is off the right edge of the fabric. I'm not going to cut the bit that I've left open. I'll leave that seam allowance whole because it actually makes it easier to tuck it inside when you need to later on. So that little bit I leave uncut. So that's now ready for me to zip round there very quickly. So again, I'll start from here, zip round with a zigzag stitch all the way round, just to make sure those edges don't fray away. So I'm turning it through, pushing out the corners, pulling them out. And that's ready to have a nice press, tucking the raw edges under of the opening gap. So I tuck those under ready. I'm going to pop a pin in place so that when I press this, those edges will be pressed in as well. Then it's ready to insert the cushion pad and then slip stitch the edges closed so that the cushion pad is kept inside. It does mean that if you want to wash the cushion cover, you do need to unpick that slip stitching, which is a hand stitch, so you can wash it without the pad inside. But there it is, ready to be pressed and stuffed. There it is, piping. Add it to your portfolio of techniques.